I call the Honourable David Parker.
Mr Chairman, the issues that David Clark, who's just taken a seat, referred to were all relevant. I want to hear from the Minister why it is that she thinks this bill has credibility to introduce a provision that says when formulating fiscal strategy, and this is in this part of the bill, will have regard to its likely impact on present and future generations. First point, is the Minister saying that her government until now hasn't done that? Because if she is saying that, well, that shows you what an irresponsible government this is. If she's saying they have already done it, doesn't that show that this legislation is meaningless? And thirdly, if you want an example of irresponsible failing to take into account the effects between generations, look no further than the government's head-in-the-sand attitude in respect of the age of eligibility for superannuation, gone from $7 to $10 billion per annum since 2008 till this year, more than the cost of education within the next. We're going to increase the age of eligibility over time to 67. Doesn't solve the problem, says another Luddite on the other side, Mr Goldsmith. What an absurd statement that actually increasing the age of eligibility doesn't have a substantial effect on the fiscal consequences for the ground. I have read the Treasury long-term report, and it says that if the age of eligibility is not put up, then Mr Goldsmith, unless he cuts other services, would have to increase GST from 15% per annum to 17% per annum. That's what the Treasury report says, Mr Goldsmith. So that's the first point to be made. The second point is it is very, very interesting that the genesis of this bill was with the confidence and supply agreement with Mr Banks. And I want Mr Banks to take a call to explain how he's got any credibility on fiscal sustainability. When he was last Mayor of Auckland City, he tripled council debt. Tripled council debt when he was last Mayor of Auckland City, and that's quite apart from the extra debt that was taken on as part of the formation of the so-called super city. Fiscal caps are nonsense. The Christchurch earthquake shows if you had a fiscal cap and the government couldn't have paid for the rebuild or part of the substantial cost of the rebuilding in Christchurch because of a fiscal cap and legislation, what a nonsense, what a nonsense. We've seen the effect of that on things like education services in California. Once had amongst the best state-based education system in the United States, had a fiscal cap, as a consequence couldn't keep increasing spending for education in the way it needed to, and indeed had to cut their spending on education because they spent so much money on prisons, and as a consequence the Californian education system, state-based education system, is a shadow of its former self. That's the sort of policies that we get from the ACT Party, ill thought out, and would take this country backwards even faster than this current national government is. The second point I want to make is in respect of this sort of legislation, there should be agreement across the parties, the major parties, if it's possible. We asked for some pretty minor concessions in respect of this. We thought that the wording around monetary policy was one-sided and shows how ridiculous it has become that the Treasury and the government think that the only thing that's relevant in respect of monetary policy is what the Reserve Bank does. And we said, well, that's ridiculous. We think that there is obviously parts of monetary policy that is delegated to the Independent Reserve Bank, and it should be, but there are other parts relating to monetary policy, including policy advice that the government should get from the Treasury.
I don't believe in contestable advice.
Well, that might be the case, Dr Clark. I can't understand their unwillingness at a time when monetary policy is in a state of flux around the world, with these enormous trade surpluses in some countries and big trade deficits and current account deficits like New Zealand has, currently the worst in the developed world, and yet they won't concede that in respect of fiscal responsibility you have to have an eye on that as well, because fiscal settings do affect monetary policy and trade balances. But the government refused to agree. The second area where we thought that we should be making an amendment if they wanted cross-party accord on this was something like the Australian equivalent legislation, which refers to adequate national savings. Of course, New Zealand has national savings through our current account deficit, worst in the developed world. So Mr. Chairman, I would like the Minister to respond as to why those issues couldn't be accommodated.
Mr. Chairman.
I recognise the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
And likewise, sir.
That's good.
Mr. Chairman, I too